Hi friend, we have a new website live, transfieldguide.com. There you can find episodes with show notes, our resource page, and links to both our Amazon wishlist and our PayPal donation. If you'd like to support the show, please consider a one-time or recurring donation. Every penny helps. The information and opinions presented in this podcast are based on research done at a particular point in time. The fields of medicine, surgery, psychology, etc. are constantly evolving as new studies and movements happen. Please take into account the year of any particular episode's publication, and as new information presents itself, we will do our best to release updated episodes on the topics. Listener discretion is advised for references to medical terminology of body parts. Unless otherwise stated, no one speaking on this podcast is a medical or legal professional and cannot provide medical or legal advice. Welcome to the Trans Field Guide. Today on the show, I have James Din, aka JD, a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Texas. Thank you for being on the show. That does tend to be the main reason why people do end up going stealth, is because they feel they have something to lose by being open. Usually the threat of bodily harm. But I also know some people that very much have the mentality of, I know who I am. I don't have to tell anybody a damn thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, I have a mixed relationship with the word stealth. But there are plenty where transgender is not part of their identity. The other gender label, most of the ones that drop the transgender label, the ones I've encountered are usually within the binary. It's just saying, like, no, don't identify me as transgender, just man. Yeah. I guess, in a sense, the identity pride in that point is just simply man, not in being transgender. And so that's that person's best way of honoring that identity, is not having to go through that constant coming out process over and over and over again with every person that they meet. That can be... that's exhausting.
Especially when it's having to re-come out to the same person because it didn't stick the first time.
Well, I get a good handful of clients also that have all this anxiety over, like, okay, I've tried out this particular identity or this particular name, and now I feel guilty because I've learned more about myself, and now I want to go by another different name or a more exact label, which winds up being this inconvenience for the people in their lives.
And with that, you always have the people that have the attitude of, oh, well, but if they love you, then they'll keep up with all of your changes. But it's also kind of one of those things, it's like the other people in your life are still human as well. It's exhausting for that side, too. What do you recommend for keeping a good balance between the, if you love me, you'll learn all of my pronouns and names and stuff as they develop, versus it's okay, they're trying, they're putting in effort, they're still stumbling type of thing? Like, where do you think there's a good balance between the two?
It's a great question, and it's one that definitely comes up a lot, and I've wound up working with clients to kind of figure out the individualized answer. It winds up being a journey, and then other people can wind up joining them on that journey. And, well, it's complicated because you have to figure out what's within someone's value system. It can be really important for a particular person to make room for these other people that are in their life. Especially when it comes to close family members, they can feel this strong obligation to take care of their family member, even to the point of putting their needs, their family members' needs, above their own. That's something that we often laud as really virtuous. But then that can wind up contributing to your own suffering. So you have to figure out, is that the price that you're willing to pay, is slowing down this particular process in order to maintain someone else's journey alongside you, versus separating your journey from their journey, which, if you take that route, it takes a lot of the pressure off of trying to maintain someone else's process of understanding this. And I think there's a lot of room for negotiation there, to say that, okay, I understand that this is brand new to you as a sofa, as an ally, and this is going to take your time, and at the same time, I'm going to keep on moving forward. But that means the price of that separation might mean that that part of you that's very loving and caring for that person might be a little unsatisfied with that. So many of our adult decisions aren't in that zone where it feels 100% good. Whereas sometimes I have people go through basically like a cost-benefit analysis, where it's more than just listing out the pros and cons of whatever decision that they want to make, But when they do that, I actually have them weigh out the different category, but they have to add up to 100%. So many people, it's like, okay, these things, it's so important for me to, I don't know, be a good spouse. And that means A, B, and C. So that's 100% important to me. And then it's like, oh, but I need to be myself. That's 100% important to me. It's like...
you can't have 200% of yourself.
Yeah, I think people try, and I think we can almost kind of reach that for like short spurts, but it's not sustainable. So if you think about like, okay, what is this when I really step back, understand both logically, emotionally, or even spiritually, like how can I weigh this? And if it's one that's like, okay, still pretty heavy in one direction, let's say 80% one and then 20% on the other side, I say give yourself enough self-compassion to say that yes, it's 80% important for me to do this step in my transition, and then be 20% upset with that decision.
Which is fair. And this brings up like a whole nother jump in topic, but it's very common for sofas to talk about their mourning process when their person comes out to them. But for trans and non-binary people, there's a certain amount of mourning that we have to go through as well, because each step is kind of bittersweet, because sometimes it feels like we're leaving behind a part of us that was part of our identity previously. Heard a few trans men talk about post-top surgery that they cried, but it was like bittersweet crying, because they were freed from something that they found to be a burden because it caused them dysphoria. But at the same time, they were getting rid of something that was such a part of their physical identity for so long that it also kind of made them sad. And then for some people, they end up feeling guilty about mourning what they consider to be their previous self, because you're supposed to be pro-transition all the time, 100%, question nothing.
That's one of the messages that definitely comes up. It's like, oh yeah, just gung-ho. Even former given names, we often call that dead naming. Right? So dead. Which for some people really honors that sense of transition. So often cultures around the world, death winds up being associated with change and transition. One of my old friends was super into tarot cards, and that was one of the big things, like death represents not just dying, but the end of one thing and the beginning of something new. So I think it completely makes sense that in this process, even something that you're really hoping to celebrate, etc., there might be that sense of mourning and loss. Even something that was so incredibly distressing, that has been your life. To let go of that is going to take some adjustment.
And I do think that that's a kind of an important thing for us as a community to kind of talk about, because nobody talks about it really. And most of the time that you hear about people that do end up being sad or mourning through any particular part of their transition, anything outside of, mourning the loss of a friend or a loved one from coming out to them, because that's perfectly acceptable, but we're not allowed to mourn our own bodies as we change them, which then of course becomes even more stigmatized for people who detransition, because then a chunk of the community, not the whole community, because there's a lot of mixed feelings about it, but there is a chunk of the community that almost feels like it's a betrayal if you were to detransition, to be partly way or all the way through your transition and go, I messed up.
I think so much of the community, because like that constant dysphoria is a form of trauma. Sometimes it can kind of soak into a person's sense of self. People very often wind up identifying with their own pain and suffering. And sometimes the pain and suffering actually legitimizes certain decisions. And so, especially where people have had to prove that they are in so much pain that it is impossible for them to live in the sex that they were assigned at birth, to the point of wanting to die. That can become such a strong argument that anything that threatens that person's validity. So even just me being like non-binary, and so not seeking this binary transition, winds up being pretty threatening to those that say like, where they had to defend themselves from saying that like, it's not enough for me to just change this expression. I have to go for hormone treatment, for A, B, and C surgeries, etc. And it's even kind of embedded in some of the medical system that we have, where people talk about medical necessity, right? Which is actually a lot more open than people realize. A lot of people think that medical necessity only comes about if you will die otherwise. And there's all sorts of stuff that you're not going to die from, but it's still considered a medical necessity. Oh, I have this conversation with people all the time since I teach about mental health. When we take a look at disability, a lot of people immediately only think about being able to walk across a room, for instance. When you take a look at the way that people study disability, the World Health Organization has a survey that includes things like being able to attend festivals in the same way as everyone else can, being able to socially engage with people, etc. It's really all about how is a person able to interact with the world as a fully functioning, healthy human being. And that's physically, that's socially, that's emotionally. And so if there are things that are impeding that function, then yes, we can argue for medical necessity, where this is something that is going to help that person live their life in a fully functioning way.
Like this episode? Tell someone about it. Resources referenced in this episode can be found in the show notes at transfieldguide.com. Stay safe, and remember that I'm proud of you.